child welfare, which we commonly refer to as the CEBC. So let's talk a little bit about what is this training about? What are we doing here? A common question when implementing evidence-based practices is whether and how you can change or adapt them to meet local needs. I'm sorry, when implementing evidence-based practices is whether and how you can change or adapt them to meet local needs. Whether my teleprompter, aka Word document, is failing me, without altering the content so much that the intervention is no longer effective. So this webinar will examine the issues using the KEEP model as an example, and the KEEP implementation team at the Oregon Social Learning Center will share the strategies, features, and languages. In addition, they'll discuss the use of affinity groups to address and serve specialty groups such as families partnering LGBTQ+ youth and those caring for undocumented children. Process for adaptation and the tension between adaptation and fidelity will also be covered. So before I introduce our presenters, I want to give you a few logistics, some of which are already in the chat. So if you'd advance me to the next screen, I just want to review some important details. One, this audio is being recorded. Done. Next, at the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to take a brief feedback survey. At the end of that survey, you'll be prompted to receive your certificate of completion. So again, that survey will come at the end of this webinar. Next, there is a note-taking slide. The note-taking slides are for those of you that like to follow along and take notes as you listen to a presentation. Those notes are in the chat box right now. So you'll see that link. If you click it, it'll open up a note-taking PDF for you. Next, I want to let you know that a follow-up email is sent to participants in the next couple of days. Typically, we'll give you all the information you might have missed, like where was that survey? How do I get my certificate? Is there a recording? We'll answer all that for you. Next, just want to remind you that your audio controls are at the bottom of your screen. Everyone should be muted in this call, but in the event that you're asked to unmute, you can unmute yourself there. And lastly, the last thing I want to mention is as you're responding to any prompts that happen during this webinar, so if you're asked a question and asked to put it in the chat, make sure that you're responding to everyone when you feel comfortable to do so. Now, if you have any questions for the presenters throughout the course of this webinar, you're encouraged to drop them in the chat as well, and we will answer them as we can. All right, you could take me to the next screen. And just a little reminder about the CEBC, who we are, what it is. It's funded by the California Department of Social Services, Office of Child Abuse Prevention, and operated by the Chadwick Center at Rady Children's Hospital in lovely San Diego, California. Our mission is to advance the effective implementation of evidence-based practices for children and families involved with the child welfare system. We accomplish this mission through we have two different ways of doing this. And this is actually a snapshot from the website, which is cebc4cw.org. The first is program registry. So we provide a searchable database of programs that can be utilized by professionals that serve children and families involved in the child welfare system. And secondly, it's program selection and implementation, which is guidance and resources about the implementation of evidence-based practices. So now I'd like to get us started. I'm going to introduce you to the presenters, and then I'm going to let them take it from here. So I'd like to introduce you to Patty Chamberlain. Probably can give you a little wave in the Zoom. Patty Chamberlain is a senior research scientist at Oregon Social Learning Center, a senior fellow at the Society for Prevention Research, and the developer of the TFCO, formerly MTFC, and KEEP models. She currently oversees KEEP implementation and is focused on implementation research with an emphasis on what it takes to integrate and scale up evidence-based practices into real-world agencies and systems. Next, we have Rohana Buchanan, who probably will give you a little wave in the camera or you'll talk to later, is a research scientist at Oregon Social Learning Center and the clinical director for the KEEP program. Rohana assisted in developing the teen-specific adaptation for the KEEP model, and she oversees KEEP model fidelity and adaptation. She's also the principal investigator of the SWIFT program, a preventative model to stabilize placement of students in public school settings. And last but not least, we have Katie Bennett, the director of implementation for the KEEP program, who works with all the KEEP sites on implementation, program quality, and sustainability. Katie has collaborated on the development of materials and processes that standardize KEEP implementation and provide a framework for meeting the unique needs of the communities in which KEEP is delivered. So with that, I want to turn it over to our presenters. Say thank you so much for being with us today.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, everybody, and thanks for joining us. We have been looking forward to having this talk with you. And in terms of using the chat, feel free to make comments too. It doesn't have to always be questions. I mean, you know, ideally, and we can have a conversation. I know that's a little bit hard, but let's try to let's reach for that idea. So feel free to make comments along the way. So today we're going to talk about this problem or this issue. It's actually not a problem. It's actually an opportunity of adapting evidence-based practices. And we are going to talk about that in the context of the work that we're doing right now, which is implementing the KEEP model. And we're going to talk a little bit about, our journey and our experiences and some examples of how we've done this over the years. But one of the big issues that we're going to talk about is how to maintain, what can you adapt and what do you need to keep adherent to the model so that you get the same outcomes as you did in the research studies that made the intervention and evidence-based practice in the first place. So first thing, why do we want to adapt? So, the path for becoming an EBP involves running rigorous studies with specific populations that might not represent the communities in the real world that you're implementing the intervention with. And so, in order to keep the intervention, to make the intervention relevant to every community that you go into has its own cultural aspects and its own things about it that might not map onto the populations that were included in the randomized control trials. So we want to be able to increase the relevance of the EBPs to the communities that we're actually working in, and that can increase engagement. Which is what we are going for, is we want to have good engagement. And of course, we want to have better outcomes. And one of the things that we're doing research on right now is when we do adaptations, do we in fact get better outcomes? So that's one of the ongoing lines of research that our group is working on and continues to work on. So one of the key messages I think that we want to talk about today is that adaptations should be consistent with model fidelity. If they're not, you run the risk of losing the parts of the implementation that made the intervention and evidence-based practice in the first place. Is this thing showing up? My call that I'm getting, is that showing up? There, I just got rid of it. So when you look at your evidence-based practice, it's important to understand what are the key components or building blocks for what makes that intervention work. And then once you know what the key components or building blocks are that got you the outcomes in the first place, that tells you the other parts of the model, what's flexible, what can be changed, what can be adapted. It's really important to keep your eye on fidelity. So that means adherence to those critical components that you found in the randomized trials to drive the positive outcomes. And today we're going to Rohana's going to talk about fidelity, how we measure fidelity, how we track fidelity, and Katie's going to talk about how we learn about the cultural context of the places that we're implementing. And then we're all going to talk about some examples of how we've made these adaptations. But in addition to fidelity, so knowing what the building blocks are and keeping those true throughout the adaptations, We also want to keep a close eye on the competent delivery of those critical intervention components. So are they delivered in a way that engages families? And then if you have adherence, so if you have adherence to the critical components, and then you have competent delivery, you're going to have fidelity to the model. So now I'm going to go on a little sidetrack and talk to you just a bit about what is KEEP, because we're going to be using this as an example throughout the rest of this session. And I just, want you to know what it is. So KEEP is a support and skill enhancement model for foster and kinship parents. And it draws heavily on increasing knowledge and comfort with using evidence-based parenting strategies. We run the sessions with 2 group leaders. We have 7 to 12 foster or some resource and kinship parents participating. KEEP is implemented over 16 sessions, each of which is 90 minutes long. It's very conversational. It's not a class. Each session is focused on key parenting strategies, but also on the experiences that parents are having with their kids on a daily basis in the home. We provide incentives to parents to participate. This could mean cash incentives, it could mean gift cards, but we want to recognize that parents' time is really valuable, and we want to reinforce their engagement. Each session is recorded for model fidelity, and Rohana's going to talk about that. And we also provide coaching to KEEP group leaders, and there's a certification process that KEEP group leaders achieve, and then a path for them to become coaches in the model. We also contact families on a weekly basis in a short telephone call that we call Parent Daily Report. And during Parent Daily Report calls, we're getting information from parents on the things that they found challenging and how stressful those behaviors were for them during the previous week. Having this kind of information allows us to tailor the sessions to the specific needs of the parents that are participating in the intervention. So just a little bit about, our path. We started out running RCTs funded by the National Institutes of Health, NIMH, and NIDA. We have run 7 RCTs ourselves, and we have other investigators at other sites who have also run independent evaluations of the KEEP model. We started in San Diego in the year 2000. So KEEP has been going in San Diego County for 21 years now. We've been implementing throughout England for 11 years, statewide in Tennessee, in New York City for 9 years, in Denmark for 7 years, and currently we're engaged happily in our own state of Oregon, implementing KEEP statewide in Oregon. And I'll just as a side note say that with the pandemic, we're implementing entirely virtually in Oregon across the state. And although that was, spurred by the pandemic and a necessary adaptation that we needed to make, we have found that there's a lot of positive aspects about implementing virtually that we really didn't know about before. So that's been a gift in many ways. Okay, so quickly about KEEP. So KEEP sees the parents as key change agents for kids. And we focus the key principles, the key components. So these are the things that that are not changed in adaptations. We're going to reinforce normative and pro-social behavior of the kids. So we're going to notice when kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and we're going to reinforce them. We're going to incentivize behavior that we want to see more of. We're going to work with parents to build cooperation between parents and kids. We're going to work to have parents teach kids new behaviors that they want them to learn and that are developmentally appropriate for them to succeed in both in families and in outside world settings. We're gonna work with parents to use non-harsh and effective limit setting, because limit setting is necessary often. And we're going to work with parents to manage their emotions while parenting. And any of us who have been parents, I think, can relate to the fact that that can be an important part of parenting. So now Rohana's going to take over and talk about how in KEEP we measure intervention fidelity.
Thank you, Patty. And hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. So measuring intervention fidelity involves collecting data, analyzing data, and then using what we've found in our data to support the ongoing effective implementation of KEEP. And so to start that off, every group leader who is uncertified, so that's the folks who get trained, they come in, and for the first 3 groups or so, they upload all of their video recordings and we watch all of their video recordings. And so that gives us a chance to see what's happening in real time and give support in real time. We code those, and I'll show you what our coding system looks like in a minute. But what we do is we code those, and then we are able to say, yep, things are going well. That's in the green zone. There's a couple things we need to be working on here that aren't quite meeting fidelity. That's in the yellow zone. Or, there's a few things that we need to be working on here. Then that would be in the red zone. In addition to watching the videos, we also ask the group leaders to upload their impressions, their thoughts, what they saw, what they experienced in the group, so that when we're doing the coaching, we can also get a sense of what was it like to be in the room? Because you can watch a video and you get one sense of it, but when you're actually the one leading the group or you're in the group, it can feel different. And so we want to make sure that we're getting a sense from them. And the other reason that we want to get a sense from our group leaders is that we want them to be able to come to their coaching meetings and say, hey, here's what I'd like help with. Here's what I'm proud of. Here's what went well. And here are my questions. And so it's a very interactive process. And as Patty was saying earlier, we definitely focus quite a bit on this idea that adherence to the model is important, but doing it competently is also very important, because you can read something to someone and that's sort of like adhering to all of the content, but it doesn't let it come alive in the way that we're hoping for. Because in KEEP, also as Patty was saying, this is a support group, it's not a class. And so we aren't just like delivering content to parents. We want to make sure that they also have a chance to experience the fun and the support and the collaboration that happens within a KEEP group. So that's that competence piece. Katie, you're so good at like just doing the slides and just like, it's so smooth, it's so good. I remember being in, what was it? Like all of those movies where someone would say slide and then the thing would buzz through. I guess I'm dating myself there. So our fidelity adherence rating form has, as we were just saying, it has 16 items. And when we think about the adaptation process and we think about how there's the standard model, which is the one that went through all of the RCTs, and then we've done some adaptations for specific groups, we're still using the exact same fidelity instrument. And Patty was highlighting that there are some core features of the model that are not adapted. I'm gonna stumble over my words here. One of those, of course, being we're very focused on encouragement. So encouragement underpins everything that we're doing. And so we want to make sure that that's showing up regardless of the adaptations we've done to the model. The other thing that's interesting about KEEP is that every KEEP group, even delivered to fidelity, looks a little bit different. And the reason it looks different is that there are different people in it. And the people are what make the KEEP group fun, engaging, interesting, and valuable for the parents who are there. So we have, even if I let a group in the morning and I let a group in the evening, same exact session, it's going to look totally different. And it's because the parents bring in the content. right? So they bring in how we illustrate the content. We have a parent who says, hey, you know, I'm thinking about using these examples for encouragement. I'm thinking about these incentives, and other parents have other ideas for incentives. And the conversation goes in that direction. In a different group, folks might have different ideas that they want to bring in, different things that work for them. And so every time we bring the content, but we pull in from the parents, how is it going to work in your home? What's it going to look like in your home? How do you want to use this? How does this work for your specific child in your home? So whether it's an affinity group or a standard group, these are the types of things we're doing for every single session, for every single keep group. And so naturally, when we practice skills through role play, of course, you want to say practice because nobody really wants to do a role play, but we're going to say it here because that's what we're doing. But those role plays really need to reflect the needs for the parents in that group. And I'm not going to say much about it here, but we also collect the parent daily report, as Patty was saying earlier. And what this allows group leaders to do is have a sense of the kinds of challenging behaviors that foster and kinship parents are noticing. And it's just, what did they notice yesterday? So we call and we say, did any of these behaviors happen yesterday? And if they did, were they stressful? And so we can get a sense of, are there things that we might want to bring in as a theme to a keep group so that we can support the family as they're experiencing those unique challenges? And this is and I love color coding, so that's what's going on here. This is the Fidelity adherence rating form that we use. And the blue items are those adherence items. So those are things like, did we talk about positive behaviors or progress? Did we review a home practice? Did we deliver the content? And then we also have these competence items. And the two that I wanted to highlight here, the first is number 5 and the other is 13. 5 is the group leaders effectively use the foster or kin parents' individual situations as teaching opportunities for the rest of the group. So we could have a group leader who comes in and gives an academic explanation for why incentives are important, why motivating children through the use of privileges or incentives is important. But to be competent in that delivery, we're saying, in KEEP, we use incentives. Here's some examples of incentives. Patty, what are some examples of incentives that you like to use in your home? Patty says a few examples. Katie, what are some examples that you use in your home? And then we have a conversation, and there's stories that are told about times that they worked or times that something maybe didn't go quite as well. And parents give each other suggestions and ideas. And so when we think about that competency piece, it's about using the content to engage the parents in the group in a conversation. And that's how we think about teaching, that it isn't, this is an example of an incentive. Patty, what's an example of an incentive? That's the vibe we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, and I will say that when we get feedback from participants, often it's like, I learned so much from the other people in the group. It was such a positive experience. I don't feel isolated. I feel like I have a community. And we really value bringing out people's thoughts and ideas about the various things that we're talking about. That's very important in this model.
It's extremely important, which is why I also like to highlight 13, which is about asking those questions and how to do, right? You can ask a question. Patty, what do you use for incentives? And Patty says, oh, you know, I use special dessert. And I say, why do you use that? And she's now like on the defensive, right? She's like, oh, this doesn't feel good. So instead we want to be like, hey, Patty, what's an example of an incentive you use with your child? And she says, oh, you know, I use a special dessert. And it's like, cool, what kind do you use? And what do they like? And hey, Katie, what do you use? And so we're like excited, we're curious, we're encouraging, we're warm within the model because we want to be able to ask a question and have parents feel safe being able to share exactly what's going on. We want to have everyone in the room be able to see what's happening in the parents' home. What are the challenges that they have? What are the successes they're having? We're curious and interested in those things.
Me. All right. And
it's Katie's turn.
my voice may have gone fallow. All right. So I do, implementation support for all of our sites. And before Keep Groups kick off, we spend about 3 months in pre-implementation or readiness. And during that time, we're working closely with site leadership and we're getting systems in place to launch the Keep Groups. So we have, for this process, a standardized and flexible roadmap. And in addition to all those logistical systems we're putting in place, like hiring timelines, communication plans. In addition to all that, a key component of readiness, right, is learning about a site's cultural context. So we want to know who comprises your foster care workforce. Are they primarily kinship caregivers, non-relative caregivers? Are they primarily in urban areas or in rural areas or in a mix of both? What languages do they speak? And we also want to find out what are the reasons that the site has chosen to bring KEEP in, so we can be intentional about connecting KEEP outcomes to community need. So who in your system disrupts? Who's taking longer to reach permanency? And what does foster parent retention look like for you? Mm-hmm. And so the goal here is to get this big picture of who's in care and who is caring for them and how your agency or system is working with resource parents, and then we can build out the implementation plan to fit that unique community. And during readiness, we also do a curriculum review. And it can be fairly quick, right? It can be language changes to fit the local lexicon. So earlier, Patty was talking about, or Rohana was talking about certified KEEP group leaders. In England, we're not using that term. We say accredited. And there's carers versus fostering kinship parents versus resource parents. And so this is kind of a search and replace of terms used in KEEP materials. And, a manual is not going to be written to describe every experience for every family. And so the goal is to use our manual and our materials to clearly demonstrate KEEP skills, provide a rationale. And then, as both Rohana and Patty said, in training and coaching, we really work on tools for tailoring those strategies for the families in that group. So, for example, pre-teaching about a trip to a grocery store is going to look different. A family lives in a rural area or an urban area like New York City. There might be public transport, there might be walking, there's siblings in a family, there's myriad things involved that are going to change the way that scenario is going to look for each family. And so again, when the KEEP model is delivered to Fidelity, there's no two KEEP groups that are going to look the same. The discussion and examples are always going to be specific to the families in the group. And in this way, adaptation is always happening. Like, that's at the heart of the model. But sometimes there's a larger cultural context that needs to be considered. There's cultural and societal norms, laws, and that might lead to a larger adaptation. So for the remainder of this talk, we're going to home in on 2 ways that we're adapting KEEP to serve unique community needs. So there's cultural adaptation, which is a comprehensive review and where the KEEP curriculum is modified, enhanced as a whole, and maybe a new manual is created. And that reflects, larger societal or cultural norms or specificity, laws, this larger context. And Rohana's going to take over here and give a couple examples of what this process looks like. And then I'll come back and talk about another form of adaptation, which is affinity groups, where all the families in a group or the youth they're caring for have a shared characteristic besides parenting. Rohana, over to you.
Next slide. Thank you, Katie. So we got to go to Denmark, and we had to provide you with a sweet photo of the smorgasbord, because when you get there, it's all about amazing things on bread. Yeah. Anyway, so if you're ever feeling like you want to get into the Denmark spirit, just put something amazing on some toast. So to start in Denmark, the very first thing we did is we went and we looked at, someone agrees with me in the chat. We went to Denmark and we sat with the leadership and we went through the manual, and they said, well, there's a couple things in here that we need to adjust. The first is pretty much this is great, but there's a couple little things we need to tweak here. And one of those things was that the concept of timeout. The process that we use, the structure that goes into it, the KEEP model for timeout is totally fine. we just need you to call it something else. Because timeout in Denmark has a specific connotation that is not going to get you buy-in from parents. So we want to call it take a break. So that's a search and replace idea, right? We go in, we do that, and we call it take a break. But that was pretty much it. Otherwise, they were like very stoked about the 4 to 12-year-old model. So we train them, they run several groups, we have a great time, and they say, we're ready for the teenager version. We're ready to do Keep Safe. And so we do the same process. We say, well, here's the Keep Safe manual. And they come back and they say, whoa, hey, there's a bunch of things we have to change here. And there's a whole host of things that we sit down with them for a week, and we go through every single session in great detail. And we talk about why we do things the Keep way. And they talk about what will work or what would need to change in Denmark. And some examples are how we talk about sex. That was the first one they said. There's a whole session on just how do we talk to teens about sex and how to be safe. And they said the way that it's written here is more about it's very American. And in Denmark, we just talk about things a little bit differently. And so we walked through that session and we redid the examples, we adjusted ages, and just to bring it in line with the cultural norms for Denmark. Similar to talking about drugs and alcohol. One obvious difference, and this is one of those legal differences that Katie was talking about earlier, is that the drinking age is 21 in the United States, but it's much younger in Denmark. 16 for beer and wine, it's 18 for hard alcohol. And so there are different cultural norms and also laws that come into play. So there was language there that was changed. Another was about technology and social media. So in the United States, if you can check a kid's phone or their computer search history, and you cannot do that in Denmark. And so how we would talk about technology and use of social media was very informed by the laws in place in Denmark. And then the last piece was they said, the other thing is that, once a kid turns 16, we're focused on independence. What are those skills they need to be independent? And we spent a lot of time here figuring out exactly how to do this and how to fit that in with the Keep way, because it is woven through other sessions. In many ways, that's a theme throughout many of the sessions. And what they wanted was a session where foster parents and resource parents, kinship parents, would have a chance to focus really a little bit more deeply on those things related to helping my kid get a bank account, helping my kid learn how to do their laundry, helping my kid learn how to whatever. And so we put some framework and some content and some language in for that piece. And during the process in Denmark, we sort of were learning as we went for that like full cultural adaptation. And when it came time to go statewide in Oregon, and we developed a partnership with the Native American Youth and Family Center, we had a process to be able to go through every single session, listen, sort of explain why we do things the Keep way, but also listen to what the needs were for their specific community. And so the first thing I want to say about the adaptation with NAYA is that this is an adaptation for NAYA. It is not an adaptation for all Native American youth or all tribal communities everywhere. And Katie, can I get a slide?
I just want to go back, and this is the picture, in case you missed it, is Rohana's manual of the Keep Safe manual for teenagers. Was this from Denmark or NAYA? I don't know.
This was from NAYA. This was from NAYA. So we did the 5-day training with them.
The stickies have to do with, we need to
do something here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And some of those we need to do something here are big things. And so structurally, there are some really big things that we adapted for NAYA. And some of them were more like subtlety in language. So some of the big things were that for every NAYA Keep group, there's a land acknowledgement at the beginning. And there's also a tribal specific closing activity that happens at the end of every session. And so those are customized depending on who's in the group, where they are, and which tribes the youth or the parents in the group were affiliated with. Another piece was that there was explicit language about learning about, respecting, understanding, and creating opportunity for youth to connect with cultural activities, items, rituals, etc. And the goal here is to create a sense of belonging, but also to elevate and enhance their cultural experience and their cultural identity. So there's explicit language in the NAEA manual about what can and cannot be used for an incentive. So for example, going to a cultural activity is not an incentive. And it's also not something that you would use as a privilege to remove, because it's considered necessary for the teen or the child's development. Patty, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to say, I'll say something after you're finished talking about NAEA.
Okay. There's also language in session 1 right away where we ask the parents to think about what's the language that the child or the teen uses for their identity, and how does that, and how can they support the development of that over time. There's also language in there because the majority, so not all, but the majority of the parents who are caring for the youth in these groups are white families. And so there's language in there to help them understand the context more of parenting a child of color and how to do that within the context of the KEEP skills.
So I was just going to say that this kind of stuff is so much fun for us because we're always learning about where we're going. And when we, it keeps, I think, really helps keep the team, the implementation team engaged and, having a lot of curiosity. And that's a really positive thing for us when we do these various adaptations.
The other piece that comes out is that every time we do an adaptation, we learn something that improves our model for the rest of the groups. So there are things that we learned from Denmark that then were translated into the SAFE manuals that we use in the United States. And there are things that we learned through the process with NAEA that also have been infused in all of the manuals, because there's something that we get to learn and we get to have, like Patty's saying, it's a really fun process and we get to learn a lot. And so we want to make sure that it's that some of those things go out to the benefit of all. And there's a question in the chat. So I'm understanding correctly that you give potential sites the manual during the readiness phase. And this is a Katie question.
Yes, during the readiness phase. So once we are working with a site, we enter, this 3-month process before launching groups. And yes, definitely a curriculum review is part of that initial kind of conversation and having the manuals. So affinity groups. So affinity groups serve a specialized need and bring together families who have a shared characteristic besides parenting or are caring for youth who do. And, LGBTQIA plus youth are overrepresented in the child welfare system. They're less likely to reach permanency than their heterosexual peers. They're also less likely to be placed in a family setting. When they are in a family setting, they're more likely to have multiple placements. And so these initial LGBTQIA plus affinity groups were built with connections from child welfare staff, working with families, and from families themselves. So like in any KEEP group, families have a range of parenting experience and comfort parenting. And in this case, a range of experience and comfort parenting LGBTQIA plus kids. And this is a spot where the peer support and shared experiences of KEEP groups are really key. So for these groups, these particular affinity groups, we're really fortunate. We have a KEEP group leader who's both very experienced in the KEEP group model and has also been working in professional settings with the LGBTQIA plus community for a long time. And having a lead who's really informed means that the parents don't have to worry about trying to explain aspects of their LGBTQIA plus child's experience for the group leader to understand, right? There's less measured language in that. And, she's great. She's really comfortable normalizing experience. So when she's first talking with parents, she might say, I'm a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, and I still have to ask my friends' kids to help me with language sometimes. Like, terminology is complicated. Let's not have it get in the way of us having a discussion and feeling safe here. When we were first looking at this curriculum, we started with the removal of unnecessarily gendered language or gendered examples. And like Rohana just said, this resulted in a change to our base manual. There's a constant feedback loop between the adaptations we're doing and improvement of our core curriculum. Throughout these groups, there's a thread of culture and identity woven in. So these are concrete tools and discussion about ways that resource parents can notice and reinforce their culture or their youth's culture and identity. So for instance, observing how teens refer to and describe themselves, and then using that same language in the group, when they're in a keep group, and then also with the youth themselves. But of course, parenting material applies. You still want a strategy for enforcing curfew. And in this case, the parents may have less anxiety when discussing curfew in the context of their teen going on a date with a same gender peer. So it removes the anxiety of how other parents are going to respond to the youth's, LGBTQIA plus identity. In a recent group, it came up that a youth was starting testosterone for the first time, and that may not have come up in a group that wasn't an affinity group. We also recently in Oregon.
Can I say one thing really quickly?
I wish you would get in.
There's another piece of feedback that we've gotten from parents where for this particular affinity group, where they've said, I strive to be as respectful as I can with the language, and I appreciate being able to come to this affinity group so that I can feel comfortable learning language, and that other people are also in this group striving to use respectful language, and that there's a community of folks who are saying, like, I don't always get it right, but we're all trying, and so can we learn from each other? And there's sort of like beautiful piece that comes out of that too.
Yeah, and everybody's in there, I know, to support a teen in their home who has this identity. Yeah. So in Oregon, we recently also launched affinity groups for families caring for unaccompanied minors. So we've completed 2 groups so far. One was a Spanish language group and one was led in English. For this group, again, we're partnering with advisors who work with these families and youth, and also with Centro Cultural, which is a really incredible organization serving the Latino community in the Portland area here in Oregon. They're also a keep provider. And so we work with them to lead these groups. And we did an exit interview at the end of the 16-week groups, these 2 affinity groups. And what we heard from these families was that connection, the community of shared experience, like those were the big takeaways. Like they had a resource now to support them on what was this unique journey. There weren't other parents who were having the same experience, and they had community and connection around that. So some things with that group, the families in there discovered that each had a youth in their home who spoke as their first language an indigenous Guatemalan language. And so they were able to connect these teens whose first language was the same, and they met in that group. Throughout the group, they're also navigating and sharing resources with other families who are parenting a young adult. So often these youth are 18 or older, but who are also in custody of the state. They're balancing parenting and their personal home expectations with independence, because these are young adults. And then also working through things, navigating complicated systems like immigration. We also have affinity groups for families caring for non-system involved kinship families. So kinship families have been part of KEEP since the first RCT 21 years ago, and there are kinship families in pretty much every KEEP group everywhere at any time. But non-system involved kinship families are new, and so we're working on these affinity groups with them. So these where the kids are not in the custody of child welfare. So according to the 2019 census, there's about 30,000 families outside of the child welfare system in Oregon who are relatives caring for children in lieu of their biological parents. And these families come in this case, again, it's a partnership. This is a really key word on all of these, both adaptation, any variety of adaptation, but we have a partnership with the Oregon Kinship Navigator program. And so they're referring families, we're referring, connecting families back for resources. We also get a lot of input from other community partners. And now that the groups are established, we're on, I think, about the 10th Keep for Kin or kinship specific group here. Families are starting to seek these groups out themselves. And they're hungry, for connection and community, because in operating outside of the system, they don't have access to as many resources and services. And so in this place, there's other families with a possibly similar experience, and a normalizing of that experience. So being able to navigate parenting a relative's child or children outside of the system, normalizing that situation in the same way as the other affinity groups means language can be less measured, and the focus really can be on behaviors and strategies. And the goal with these is to support, kinship families, to support placement stability and prevent possible entry into the system. A new group we have that is just about to launch in the next 2 weeks is a group for transracial fostering. And so this is for foster parents who are caring for children or youth of a different race or ethnicity than themselves. And again, just like Rohana talked about with the NEA groups and with all of the affinity groups, there's a thread, right, that's pulling through about how families are fostering belonging, how they're supporting the positive identity of the youth in their home, how they're keeping them connected to their culture or ethnicity, and having a place where they can practice advocating and supporting those youth when they do face prejudice. And again, this is an iterative process. So these groups have all come up in Oregon based on the needs of the communities, conversations with child welfare workers, with families themselves, community partners. There's always this ongoing discussion. And so there's always feedback about groups that may be useful for supporting other families. So for instance, we had somebody reach out about doing a Keep Affinity group for teens who are parenting themselves or are expecting, so going to be parents themselves in that generational, foster care. Patty, I talked myself out. Will you talk about Stacy Tiberia's work a little bit?
Yeah, my dog was whining, so I muted myself. You might hear a little whining in the background. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're trying to do some rigorous research. One of our colleagues has applied for a grant from NIMH to look at, what are the outcomes for affinity groups relative to if you just serve these people in the regular population. And, just looking at the beginning data that we have, what we've run, when at the time she did this analysis, it's more now, but at that point we'd run 13 affinity groups with 86 parents. And one thing that really popped right on out is that there's a difference in attendance rates, in that what happens with KEEP is that parents will sign up, and about 12.5% of those parents who sign up never make it to a group. And so, you have sort of more people signing up than actually are participating in the program. And, we want to, and that might mean that they're going to another group, or that they can't do it now for time reasons. They're going to do it later. It doesn't mean that they're not ever going to get KEEP. They might not ever get KEEP, but at any rate, all we know is that about 12.5% of people that initially raise their hand and say, yeah, I want to participate in a KEEP group, do not. In affinity groups, that number is 1%. So it seems like affinity groups have a bigger pull. If people sign up for an affinity group, they're going to be there with very, very few exceptions. So that's interesting, and so that, not that attendance is an outcome, but you're not going to get outcomes without attendance. So that's one of the early indicators that affinity groups seem to be working. And we have to keep, because we have to keep our eye on that data. Because we want to be able to show that the effort I mean, we deeply believe that affinity groups are really important, but people deeply believe a lot of things, and we want to be able to have the data to show that actually it is working. And so these data here show that it appears to be working for just initial engagement and attendance to use the affinity groups. And so we continue as we talked about in the beginning and throughout. We stick with our core components. We stick with our fidelity monitoring strategy. We don't change any of that. That's kind of the rigid part, if you will, of the KEEP model. But and I thought Rohana put it really well. I think, we sort of laugh about this, but, because affinity groups or adaptations, it's sort of a concept, but actually it bleeds into everyday work, because every group is different from every other group, because the parents are different and they have different concerns, the kids are different, and that's all part of being human. So every place we work, we get a real boost out of, because we continue to learn and understand more about people, and therefore hopefully we're able to, in some kind of an effective way, bring that into the KEEP curriculum. I think that there's probably nothing more important for us than partnerships. And, we see those in the partnerships that parents form with each other when they participate in a group. Where we have the most successful implementations are where we have strong partnerships with the community, with leadership, and enduring partnerships that can withstand leadership changes over time. So those are the things that we really feel are super important for us. So I think, is that our last slide, Katie? Yeah. So let's talk now. Please unmute. How are we doing on the chat?
We have one question that I answered in the chat, but I thought it was maybe a useful one to highlight for everybody, because Jessica asked an excellent question, which is, if you're making all these changes to the manual, how do you actually get that out to sites in some sort of reasonable way, right? If we're in all of these different places. And so I just wanted to comment that it can take time. Like realistically, that can take some time. But our goal is, and this is Dashel. This is Dashel, Patty's dog, just joined us. That what happens is we say, oh my gosh, we have to make that change in all of our manuals. And sometimes it's as easy as making a change to the version that's in the PDF up on our web-based system, if it's a small thing. And sometimes it takes more of an integration. So adjusting the language throughout all of our manuals to be more gender neutral was a big change. And that took quite a bit of time. And we wanted to do that really thoughtfully. So we spent time to go through the manuals and to roll that out in a more thoughtful way. And then typically what we do for those sites that are actively continuing to implement KEEP is that we'll do a masterclass. And we'll talk about what those changes are to the manual. We'll talk about why they are, and we'll talk about how to use them effectively with families. And what we often find is that folks are like, great, we were wondering if we could do that.
Sorry.
Yeah, but it can take a couple of years to fully trickle down into what's. So the changes from Denmark, for example, it took us a little while to make sure that we had everything we've learned from them, and then look at our manual and think about how do those changes fit within the context in the United States.
The other thing I would say about that is that we have, just like, we're focusing on coaching group leaders and sites, we have weekly meetings for our coaches, and that's a lot of the grist for those meetings is what have we learned and how are we, and so we don't, manuals are the most important when you're learning an intervention, and then they pretty much stay on the shelf. So it's not as if people are like all the time reading their manual. No, the way to kind of get it into practice is to do that. So that if coaches are aware and able to integrate some of this stuff, then they're able to pass that on to to the sites.
The other question we have is from Jennifer, which says, how do you decide what can be changed and what cannot be changed? We get this question a lot at the CEBC.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I would go back to that slide 6 that Patty was talking about. These are the core things.
Yeah. Slide 6 is like you know, so we actually have done, we have a number of studies that are really boring that show a direct connection between these core key components and outcomes. And so those are things we do not change. So is it possible to bring up slide 6 here? Just to be totally nerdy about this. Let's see how good you are at this. Okay.
Oh, it might be, it's the keep components one. I think I might have a different version.
Okay, hold on. Let me just drive there.
Drive there, baby.
Getting it. And we're in.
There we go.
7.
So
live.
these are the things
We're live.
that we already decided we're not changing these. This is decided. There's no, what incentives we use could be very different. That we use incentives, no. So it's the difference between the what and the how. This is the what. The what doesn't change. The how can change, right? But the what's got to stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
So Jennifer, does that do it for you? Does that address the issue? Or should we say more? She's still muted, so we don't know. Oh, she's gave me a thumbs up.
Okay, I love a thumbs up. So good. We have had, so Carol's asking, what's an example of something that a location wanted to change and it was a no-go? And a brief story about timeout. So there was a site that wanted to change timeout to be where you would hold the child rather than having them sit somewhere even nearby, but you would remove attention. And we had long conversations with them about why we don't hold the child during timeout and the keep model of timeout. And it wasn't just like, no, we won't do that, but it was, let us understand better what you're hoping for and why you're asking that question. And then we want to explain to you why we do it this way. So what it is that we do, and came to an understanding about how to just talk about it a little bit differently in terms of calling it take a break. And it wasn't Denmark, it was actually a different site, but they too wanted to call it take a break instead of timeout because timeout came loaded. And so that was an example of we changed something, but we didn't change the underlying how timeout functions. And I think are we at time? I'm gonna leave.
I think we have, do we have till 11:30 or 11? I wasn't clear about that.
I think we're officially till 11, but we can go a little bit over if we'd like to.
Oh, okay, we're till 11. Okay, so are there other?
There were 2 questions in the chat. So from Allison, it says you discussed fidelity measurements indicating areas in the green zone or red zone. Can you speak to how targets or benchmarks were determined for this?
Rohana, you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Really long time. And, I thought it was really fun. It was a pretty deep, nerdy dive into some data. But what we did is we had a big group of folks. We had about 15 coders, and we had folks coding a whole host of videos. And we went through and got everyone really reliable on our coding system. And then we proceeded to spend about 2 years watching and rating a ton of videos. And what we came up with in that process were also some early comparisons to some of the outcomes. So we're looking at attendance, we're looking at engagement, we're looking at kid outcomes. And so we have a sense of if folks are doing things in the meets fidelity in that green range, then we feel like on by and large, what our data was showing is that those are we're more likely to have successful youth and parent outcomes. We know that in the yellow zone, we're still going to get some of those good outcomes, but we are also seeing that there are pieces and parts of the model that are not quite adherent and we need to tighten up on. So perhaps when they ask clarifying questions, it comes across more as an interrogation than as a fun, friendly conversation with curiosity. And then in the red, we see that things are simply not happening in the way that the model goes. So perhaps when they do the timeout practice, they're completely introducing something else that is not adherent with the keep model. And so those are things we would go back to. So there's a little bit of a data side, and then there's also a little bit of a clinical judgment side to how we came up with those benchmarks. I love that question. Thank you for asking.
That is Rohana's wheelhouse. I can put up the last slide, I think, for CBC, unless there are other questions. And information.
One more question about how long you work with the sites for coaching and TA.
Oh, good.
That
Oh,
is,
thank you.
Thank you.
do you monitor their fidelity indefinitely, or at some point do sites start monitoring their own fidelity?
Katie.
Katie, do you want to do this
Yeah.
one?
Yes, I do. So we do ongoing coaching and fidelity monitoring, for instance, in England, where we're still 11 years in, now we do monitor fidelity twice a year for the ongoing keep group leaders who are there.
Yeah,
And
and
if you want more info, yeah, go ahead, Patty.
no, I think that's fine. So we gradually, so we're monitoring every session when people start. Once you get certified, that knocks down the amount of monitoring. To certify group leaders, we have somebody who hasn't been coaching them independently code some key sessions, and then if they meet fidelity on those sessions, then we're coding their sessions. We start out with like once a month, and then eventually it goes to twice a year. Mm-hmm. So you have to keep with fidelity in order to be recertified. And you have to run at least how many, one or two groups a year? Is that it, Katie? I forget.
One group a year.
Okay. Mm-hmm. To stay certified, and so that we can, make sure that you're meeting fidelity. And this happens for us. I mean, this isn't anything. I mean, as when we do our intervention trials, back to the RCT days, we're constantly monitoring the fidelity of the implementation. So it's not as if, we have to hold ourselves and everybody else to the fidelity standards.
This was super fun. Thank you. It was, great to have questions, and thank you so much for having us.
Oh, I can't see my face. Here I am.
Hello, Jessica.
Hello. Oh my gosh. I just want to say thank you on behalf of all the attendees today, on behalf of CBC. Thank you so much for being with us and giving such valuable information. We really appreciate it. And thank you for hanging out a little bit longer with us. I just want to remind everyone, there's going to be a link that's dropped in the chat for you. This is going to give you access to the survey, and you'll find your completion certificate at the end of that survey. So we're just going to drop it in. There it is. At the end of that survey, like I said, is where you'll receive your certificate. For further information, there's a couple ways you can stay connected with CBC to have access to these type of valuable trainings and information. And that would be through CBC for the number 4 CW.org. So with that, we want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.